From the snow-blown fields of Poland to the hot, dry plains of Spain, from the gates of Moscow to the gates of Vienna, battles rage. So in our La Bataille game system, we have maps that are historical representations of the battlefields that these different actions took place on. The maps themselves have a hex grid overlay that helps us facilitate the movement of our units and also the orientation of our units. These hex grids, each hex represents approximately 100 square yards. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, but for most all the games that are in the series, that's about the standard. So if you think about it, that is about the size of an American football field. Now, with the units themselves, the way that they performed in battle, they would be marching along, the men in line or the men in column or the horses. And if you think about it, I mean, I was in the marching band in high school. So, it was always important for us to stay lined up and to try to maneuver and doing our different field performances or marching in a parade. If you can imagine, that's what these units are doing and what the men are doing. So with terrain, going across terrain or moving into some sort of unusual terrain is going to be problematic for the troops. With most of the battlefields, the terrain is clear. It's fairly flat or it's wide open. There's no impediments to the movement. And so if that's the case, then the units can use their full movement value. But if they move into some sort of developed terrain, maybe there's a town, maybe there's orchards or fields or hedges, or there's a forest, moving into that area is going to slow the men down because they're trying to maintain that cohesion of kind of marching in line or marching in columns and not get all kind of spread out higgledy-piggledy. Similarly, if they have to move across a terrain feature, say a stream, that takes time. And they're trying to maintain that formation, and as they move across that stream or they move across or up or down a slope or across some other impediment, that's going to slow them down. So typically that's reflected then in the costs for the units moving into different types of terrain. And sometimes moving into different types of terrain will force them to change their formation from, for example, being in column to being into general order. So because of all these trees in this hex, this unit can't maintain its line or column orientation. The trees are getting in the way. So the men are kind of grouped up in a more general affiliation. They're still in some cohesion, but it's not the same as it was when they were out in the open field and they could line up properly. Now, in all the games, you'll find a movement or terrain chart. The terrain chart is going to tell you, given the type of terrain, what's happening to infantry units, how many movement points they have to pay to move into that terrain or to move across that terrain. Same thing with cavalry, artillery, and then units that are in skirmish order. And then you have, of course, leaders. The leaders are typically represented or thinking about the leader counters as the general who's named, but also he has a small staff with him. And usually their movement isn't as impeded purely because they have such a small group of people. They can move through the woods or across the stream without being terribly delayed, while a large formation of infantry or cavalry or artillery would be slowed down considerably. In some cases, some units can't move into various and sundry terrain or cross certain terrain. Obviously, artillery, given its nature, isn't going to be crossing heavy slopes or going across a stream or some sort of built-up terrain. You can't wheel the guns across it. And so sometimes it's not possible. Similarly with cavalry, you just can't get the horses to go up and down some of these things that are very steep banks. And so that's what you'll find with each of the games. The terrain charts will be slightly different to reflect the terrain that was there at the battlefield and the conditions that were there as well. Now, the terrain also has an effect on combat. There are some types of terrain that are very well suited for defense. So oftentimes being in the woods or being in some sort of special structure, a chateau, a church, some sort of fortification, will help the units that are defending it and provide them benefits in fire defense, as well as oftentimes they don't have to make a morale check when they are being attacked. So those are things to keep in mind. The other thing is that terrain can be used to shield your troops. So in this particular example, I've got some artillery. They can fire on this infantry unit that's in the woods. They can see it. They have a line of sight, and they can see that unit. But if I move this unit back 1 hex, now the woods are intervening between the artillery unit and my infantry, and so therefore the artillery can't fire upon them. So I could keep my infantry safe over here behind these woods, kind of keep them shielded from fire, and that would be something worthwhile. The other thing that sometimes is helpful with your terrain is it can help protect you from other types of actions. So if we have a cavalry unit that is charging, oftentimes cavalry units can only fight effectively in clear terrain. Many times they're restricted or prohibited from attacking infantry or artillery units that are in special structures or in general order terrain. Or if they do make those attacks, they are limited in their effectiveness. So deploying your troops and using the terrain features to your advantage is a big part of the game. Something else to keep in mind with terrain is that frequently the terrain is part of a victory condition. So in some games, you'll get victory points for capturing objectives that were of a tactical or strategic importance in the course of the battle. So whether it's a town or a redoubt or some other defined area, oftentimes the victory conditions for any given title in the series will have that as part of your objective. And so defending or capturing those special hexes then becomes important, and in some measure compels the players to act in some regards like the generals and the officers from that time period that would indeed fight to capture different villages or hexes, not hexes, but hamlets and special areas that were of importance in the overall scheme of the battle. One final element that's part of the battles and affects the terrain and the movement and the capabilities of your troops is weather. In some of these battles, they took place in blowing snowstorms that would have affected the ability for the men to move. It would have affected their line of sight. It would have affected the effectiveness of their musketry and their artillery. Or in other cases, you had, thunderstorms, rain that would have affected these same abilities. Or in some cases, you had terrible heat that would have fatigued the men and the horses. So, given each situation in the different battles that these games represent, those factors can then affect how far your unit might be able to fire or be able to see, or how far your unit can move. It might have movement points deducted from it, or it might be prevented from charging if it can't see a unit a certain distance from it. So all of those different restrictions will be represented in the rules for each specific game, but they're one element in the overall scheme of things that gives some flavor to the battle and help you as the gamer get a sense of what restrictions nature played in how the battle played out in reality.